As Armando was mentioning, is that okay? These gluten-related disorders became very controversial to the point in which there are two schools of thoughts. The one that believe that only people with celiac disease has to be on a gluten-free diet. That's the kind of premises that have been working for many, many years. And now there is a new wave that has generated the controversy that Armando was mentioning of the people that support the notion that everybody needs to go gluten-free because gluten can cause inflammation in everybody. And I want to, next half an hour, chat and discuss how we end up to have this kind of controversy, where the misunderstanding is, and where is the truth, that most, as everything in life, is something in between two extremes. If you look at the people that go gluten-free, for example, in the United States, and you ask, who are these people and why they go on a gluten-free diet? You have an interesting distribution. More than half of the almost 100 million people, 1 of 3, that in the United States decide to go gluten-free, they do so because they believe that gluten-free diet is healthy. And again, without too much of an understanding why it's healthy. And I believe we also need to clarify what gluten-free diet means. It means that you eliminate gluten-containing grains and substitute with alternative products like gluten-free pasta, gluten-free bread, gluten-free cookies. Honestly, I don't think that can be defined as a healthy diet, particularly if we use and abuse of these products. Because to make them palatable, they need to be enriched in fat and sugars. So definitely, I would not define that healthy. And that also explains why the other good sides, roughly 25% of the people that go gluten-free, they do so because they believe that they lose weight going gluten-free. They are not really aware of the fact that, again, if you use or abuse gluten-free products, this will be hypercaloric, and if anything, you will have, problems in terms of obesity going gluten-free and not the other way around. But the point that I really think that has become controversial and extremely interesting are the other categories left out. There is roughly 10% of these people. They claim that they have mainly GI symptoms that will not go away unless they go gluten-free. There are another 7 million people. They claim extraintestinal symptoms that we will see in a moment that will go no way unless they go gluten-free. And then there is another piece of the pie that you can barely see it. The 400,000 people diagnosed with celiac disease, they are the ones that for sure they need to go gluten-free. So this is the landscape of the people that go gluten-free in the United States. And I'm afraid that with increased information, this is a trend in many other places. So if we want to be evidence-based and correct, the first distinction to be made on this population that is fueling the popularity of the gluten-free diet is, first of all, to divide between the people that go gluten-free for lifestyle, no medical necessity, and these are the vast majority of the people that embrace the gluten-free diet, and the ones that we really do care as healthcare professional, on which I want to focus my attention today, the ones that go gluten-free for medical necessity. And in that, there are 3 subgroups. 2 that we were aware of already. 1% roughly, the general population, 0.6, 1%, that have celiac disease. 0.2, 0.5% of the people that have with allergy, that I'm not going to discuss too much today for a matter of time. And then this third new kid on the block, as Armando was mentioning, very confusing because we just learned about this entity of non-celiac gluten sensitivity for which we know very little. We don't know the mechanism, we don't know, how to diagnose correctly who are these people are. If you really want, dig a little bit more in deep details, I'm self-serving myself. We wrote this review in JAMA that came out a couple months ago that probably very factually will tell you the facts. There are very few, and the fantasies, there are very many, about these gluten-related disorders, particularly non-celiac gluten sensitivity. What we learned over the years, that there is a lot of overlap in these gluten-related disorders, the way they come about. They have some common denominators, and again, the science is building up in which you have pretty much some steps that are common. A loss of barrier function that seems to be important to start the inflammatory process. Recruitment of immune cells like neutrophils in the lamina propria, a rearrangement of the intestinal mucosa with no damage. These three pieces of the puzzle are extremely important as part of the innate immune response that seems to be associated to non-celiac gluten sensitivity. Celiac disease goes to the next step, a fourth element that is the adaptive immune response that leads to gut inflammation and autoimmune insult that characterize celiac disease. So in celiac disease, you have all four, and both innate and adaptive immunity seems to be involved. And again, now we have some understanding all these mechanisms, what innate immune response we're dealing with, why gluten may eventually trigger this innate immune response, how this really is played at the mucosal level with this, undigested gluten fragments that trigger, this response from the immune surveillance typical of epithelial cells, including production of cytokines like IL-15, release of this molecule that increase permeability that is called zonulin, increased antigen trafficking that start the inflammatory process. If you stop there, there is no tissue damage. There is just, mild inflammation with increased intraepithelial lymphocytes and nothing else, but that is what seems to be associated with non-celiac gluten sensitivity. As I told you, it's the adaptive arm that is HLA linked, typical celiac disease that leads to the autoimmune insult that we know characterizing the celiac disease enteropathy. So what we know about celiac disease, again, this is an audience that I don't have to spend too much time. At the beginning, this was the premise of pediatric gastroenterologists, and that's the reason why many of the experts in celiac disease are still pediatric gastroenterologists, because in its classical manifestation, celiac disease was considered a gastrointestinal disease of kids in the first decade of life, mainly from North Europe, with a classical clinical presentation that mimic malnutrition. So you have these kids that they look like kwashiorkor kids nowadays, malnourished kids from the third world country. So they have the big belly, submuscle, subcutaneous, fat gone, muscle wasting, and so on and so forth. The clinical presentation indeed overlap with kwashiorkor, but there is a major difference between the malnourished kids of the third world country. They look like this because they do not have food. And these kids that they have plenty of food, but they cannot make use of it because of the intestinal damage that jeopardize their capability to absorb and digest foodstuff. For many, many, many decades, we work with the premises, keeping our mind that this is celiac disease. And over the years, we learned that this is just the tip of the iceberg, because now we know that no age, no sex, no race, no tissue, no organ in our body is spared by the inflammatory process of celiac disease. It starts in the intestine, but can really affect any tissue or organ of our body. And again, I don't have the time, nor I believe will be useful to go through the litany of the extraintestinal symptoms of celiac disease. And I want to point out the fact that while the old classification was classic with the GI symptoms and malnutrition, and atypical, that was the other symptoms that involved tissue and organ other than intestine, has been abandoned. Now we talk about, GI and extraintestinal symptoms. And the reason why is because having dermatitis piriformis, anemia, short stature, osteopenia, osteoporosis, and so on, you can read that. It's not rare at all. As a matter of fact, nowadays, one of the most, if not the most frequent way that disease presents itself is with iron deficiency anemia and fatigue. No GI symptom whatsoever. And even more fascinating is the gluten impact on the brain. Anybody that takes care of patients with celiac disease knows that they may experience short memory loss, anxiety, depression, chronic headache, irritability. But what really intrigues many of the scientists, it's sometimes this neuroinflammation, because that is what we're talking about here. As you can inflame the skin with dermatitis piriformis or the joint that leads to arthritis, you can inflame the brain and can bring to much more severe clinical outcome, like ataxia. And there is this condition called gluten ataxia that is very well defined, seizures, ADHD, or autism, that now, again, are really building up the consensus of the possibility of the involvement of gluten in this clinical outcome. Celiac disease now is not considered a food sensitivity or allergy or intolerance as in the past. Now it's truly an autoimmune disease, actually one of a kind. Because compared to many other immune diseases, there are some features that we know about celiac disease that we do not know about many other autoimmune diseases. Like all the autoimmune diseases, two key pillars is genetics and the environmental trigger that we're going to discuss a little bit more in details. But the peculiarity is that genetics, for example, some of these genes, particularly HLA, DQ2, DQ8, they have an unparalleled penetrance in celiac disease compared to all the other autoimmune diseases. Almost 100% of people with celiac disease, they have either DQ2 and or DQ8. To the point that we make use of this information for diagnostic purposes. Granted that 40% of the population, general population, they also may have these genes. We look for the genetics, the HLA, not to confirm celiac disease because we can't distinguish between celiacs or the 40% of the general population. But if you check for these genes that they are not there, you pretty much can rule out celiac disease, meaning the genetic testing in clinical practice has a very, very strong negative predictive value. But the other thing that is peculiar of celiac disease compared to all other autoimmune diseases, this is the only autoimmune disease for which the trigger is known, that is gluten. And therefore, celiac disease is being used as a paradigm of autoimmunity, as a model in which genes plus environment is equal autoimmunity. And with the genetic revolution of Human Genome Project, we were able now to look for, quote unquote, the genes associated to celiac disease. And this GY studies brought to the identification along the 23 chromosome of humankind of many, many genes that we know are associated with celiac disease. But what kind of lesson we learn by doing this? There is no such a thing of D genes for celiac disease, or D genes for prostate cancer, or D genes for IBD. There are genes, they are associated mainly because of their function. And when the people, they start to look at the function, in this case, I put here two examples, IBD on the left and celiac disease on the right. Even if the genes are different, very, very different, they do the same function. So the function is much more important than the gene itself. So genes related to innate immunity, genes related to adaptive immunity, genes related to the inflammasome, genes related to barrier function, they all have been found to be associated with celiac disease. But in one population, for example, the maximum population, if you look for these genes, you have a series of genes, while in another population, let's say in Argentina, maybe different genes, but they do the same kind of function. So again, now our attention is not focused on the single gene, but because technically we can do that, we look at the entire 23,000 genes of the human genome, and we ask ourselves, if we have a normal population that is at the top of that slide, that express this gene at certain levels, how the genes of a celiac compare in terms of the expression. And you see in the middle, there are some genes that are overexpressed, the one in maroon, and some genes that are down-regulated, they are in blue. There is a huge difference between the two. Looking at which genes are up or down can give us the key of what goes wrong in terms of losing tolerance and develop celiac disease. Most importantly, because this is the only disease for which we have a treatment, not a cure, a treatment. If you compare celiacs in active phase, the middle, with the celiac that are in remission because on a gluten-free diet, you see some of these genes to go back to normal, but others that stay up or down. So what we call technically constitutively up or down regulated. Those genes will give us the genetic signature of what it takes to develop celiac disease, with unbelievable repercussion in the future for preventive medicine. What about the environmental factor? Again, gluten has been studied over and over again, and the only point that I want to make here, one of the best components of gluten, alpha-gliadin, has been studied in deep details, and the bottom line is there are some undigestible fragments, here color-coded, that have been matched and in terms of function. So we know, for example, that red little loop down there induce apoptosis. The yellow loop, big loop on the top, induce excessive inflammation. The two blue fragments, when bind to a specific receptor, they release zonulin, making the intestinal liquor. So the more I study this, the more it looks like that by mistake of evolution, gluten is triggering the same weaponry, the same response from the immune system that we deploy when we are under attack by a microorganism. Based on this data, some people took this out of context and said, well, since gluten does this, it does this to everybody. People with celiac disease, people with no gluten sensitivity, normal people, everybody needs to go gluten-free because it's creating inflammation. Well, believe it or not, we're under attack every day by microorganisms. And every day we deploy the same weapons. We rarely lose this battle and we develop inflammation. As a matter of fact, it's important that we are under attack so the immune system stay tuned, stay prepared when it's really needed. By the same token, everybody with celiac disease may have this response, but very few lose the battle and develop one of the gluten-related disorder. And that's the reason why I believe it's not wise to go everybody on a gluten-free diet. I told you that celiac disease, beside an interesting clinical condition, is becoming a paradigm to study autoimmunity. And when we reiterate the concept, to develop autoimmunity, you need the genes and you need the environment. They are necessary and sufficient. Celiac disease taught us otherwise. Because there are some things at odds with this paradigm. For example, if those two are necessary and sufficient, then we should have 100% concordance in identical twins. Identical genes, they both eat gluten, but there is only 75% concordance. It's high, but in 25% of the cases, a twin has celiac disease and the other one does not. How do you explain that if those were necessary and sufficient? Wide range of onset of disease. Somebody can start disease at 2 years, some at 82 years of age. I told you already this is a systemic disease. Why some people they have symptoms that involve the joint and other the brain? We don't know. But the deal breakers were this observation of prospective studies of at-risk people follow over time. They show that this individual today has no celiac disease, and the same individual 5, 10, 20 years later, after being capable to tolerate gluten for so long, lose that luxury and develop celiac disease. Imagine the repercussion to learn, one, how you learn to have tolerance, what it takes to have tolerance, and most importantly, what needs to happen to you to lose tolerance to an antigen that leads to autoimmunity. And the epidemiology show us that, at least in the United States, and now we see this in Europe and in Latin America, celiac disease doubled every 15 years. So, what is fueling these epidemics? Quality of gluten, quantity of gluten, breastfeeding? We don't know. And studies have been done following babies at risk, in this case for 10 years, to try to answer the question, and nothing gave us a logical explanation. We thought that there was a window of tolerance between 4 and 7 months that was ideal to introduce gluten to maximize tolerance. It didn't work. Breastfeeding, I will have bet everything on it, is not protective. Early introduction to teach the immune system to tolerate gluten, or late introduction to give the immune system the time to learn how to tolerate gluten, did not work. The only thing that came out was that infection seems to be associated with the risk of celiac disease if experienced in the first year of life, and the genetic that we knew already. And that brought us to the microbiome as the culprit and help us to rewrite the syndicate, what it takes to develop autoimmunity. You need genes, you need the environment, but there are 3 more elements that are absolutely necessary, namely loss of barrier function, as I told you, so that these 2 worlds that are normally segregated can interact. An immune system does something wrong, and the microbiota that goes out of balance, what we call dysbiosis. This brings to the clinical outcome. Now, we have several targets to try to mitigate celiac disease. Not only the environment, given the fact that the genes are not a target because we can modify them, but now we can modify gut barrier, we can modify the immune system, or we can modify the microbiome, and we can reach the same final destination of controlling celiac disease. And we know about the microbiome, and there are many studies, including ours, that show that kids with celiac disease have a different microbiome than kids that don't have celiac disease. And there's a lot of stuff that needs to be done. What are the key questions still open for celiac disease? What are the best diagnostic strategies? We started 30 years ago with 3 biopsies. Then we went down to 1. The more recent ESPGHAN criteria suggests that a subgroup of children, at least kids, may have a diagnosis without doing an endoscopy. Is that really the way to go or not? Where are the risks? Where are the benefits to skip biopsies and endoscopy in these kids? How do we properly follow up patients? You know, the TTG antibodies is very robust for diagnosis, but now we know it is not as robust for monitoring. It's the only thing that we have, but that's not robust. Should we screen actively celiacs for other autoimmune comorbidities? What we're going to do when there is discrepancy between serology and endoscopy? Positive serology, negative endoscopy, negative serology, positive endoscopy. How we handle this, folks? At the point of care tests, the one that you do home, something useful and appropriate for diagnosis and management, now there's a lot of debate there. Is really the gluten-free diet the gold standard for the treatment of celiac disease as we've been predicated so far? Or there is the possibility that not only a negative impact on quality of life, but the efficiency of the diet is not as strong as we believed before, as now seems to, come up with this recent data. How we have to check for cross-contamination. And there are any alternative or complementary treatment in the gluten-free diet at the horizon. There are many, but, this is an object and another symposium. I want to finish up by touching on the non-celiac gluten sensitivity. We start with Hippocrates that described celiac disease 2,000 years ago. And then Bernardino Ramazzani from Padua described the Baker asthma for the first time. And Anna Sapona is the one that put back, not that she discovered, it was already reported in the 70s, but put back to our attention this non-celiac gluten sensitivity. And if you look at this data from UK, there are a lot of people that seems to self-report to have non-celiac gluten sensitivity, 13%, compared to 0.8% of celiacs. But what is gluten sensitivity or non-celiac gluten sensitivity? We don't know. The diagnosis is by exclusion criteria. So are cases of reaction to gluten, ingested gluten-containing grains, in which celiac disease and wheat allergy have been ruled out. Not much there, but that's as much as we have because we don't have biomarkers. What kind of symptoms? Undistinguishable from celiac disease. They totally overlap. They are intestinal, like bloating, abdominal pain, diarrhea, epigastric pain, and so on, and extraintestinal, the most important being chronic fatigue, headache, and quote-unquote foggy mind. These people, they don't think straight. And there is a lot of controversy about gluten sensitivity at IBS because there is a lot of overlapping between the two because the most important GI symptoms are abdominal pain, bloating, and irregular bowel movements. And without going too much in details and time that I don't have, if we want to be systematic, we can divide the IBS-like syndrome in these categories, in which, you have the clear-cut knowledge, starting from the bottom, adverse reaction to food, bacterial overgrowth, and now gluten-related disorders, and then IBS, for which we know not much. And now there is also this involvement of IBS and gut permeability that seems to play a role when gluten is introduced in the diets. So no self-diagnosis, no elimination diagnosis. A positive diagnosis would be extremely welcome, but we don't have the biomarkers yet. We have the biomarker for celiac disease, we have the biomarker for wheat allergy, but not for gluten sensitivity. That's where is the challenge. If and when we will have biomarkers, then we can understand more about celiac disease. Because we are with non-celiac gluten sensitivity where we were with celiac disease 30 years ago. At that time, no biomarker for celiac disease, and look how much progress we made. So eventually we got there, but we're not quite there yet. Thank you.